Hi, thanks for coming to the Ransomware Kill Chain, Why Companies Need It talk. I'm Kurtis Minder. I'm CEO of GroupSense. I'm here with Bryce Webster-Jacobsen, who's one of our Intel analyst leads, who works with me on a lot of the ransomware cases. Many of you probably just saw Bryce on the screen in the floating head scenario. So since Zoom won't let us do two floating heads, or my head is too big to fit Bryce's on the screen also, you will just hear Bryce's voice. You won't get to see Bryce, but you get to see plenty of me through the whole thing. And I can like resize myself and stuff like that. It's super cool. Okay, so just a little bit of background. I need to know how to advance the slides. There we go. So a little bit of background. I'm not going to do the credibility slides where we talk about ourselves. I'm sure you guys will get copies of these slides. You can read about us. You can Google us, things like that. But I did want to say, a little bit about the company real quick. GroupSense is a digital risk protection company. We've been around for about 8 years, focused on cyber reconnaissance, digital risk use cases for our clients. It's a subscription service looking for attack vectors and risk affecting enterprises and governments. About 2 years ago, we got involved in some of the ransomware cases just as a derivative of what we were doing in the digital risk space, where we were finding things like initial access brokers and things like that. That quickly snowballed. As you know, ransomware has been prolific in the last couple of years for a number of reasons. We'll talk about that. But as that snowballed, we became quite in demand around the ransomware response side of things. And we developed a practice over the last couple of years focused on that discipline. This talk originally, it was actually developed by and thought of by one of our top threat intel analysts, Nicole Hoffman. Nicole Hoffman, also known as @ThreatHunterGirl on Twitter, came up with this concept based on some of our real world experiences. Unfortunately, Nicole had a family emergency and she couldn't make this. So you have to put up with Bryce and I instead. And there's the, I don't know why we decided me in black and white and Bryce in color, but
yeah. I'm not sure either, but I need to get the black and white headshot, I think.
Right on. I don't know, like you look more pensive. I look like I'm high on something. But so a little bit about the ransomware market. Obviously, everyone that's attending the conference is very aware of this problem. I don't want to talk about the marketing things. I will say that the proliferation of ransomware is really affected by a number of things, in my opinion. Keep in mind that ransomware as a practice is not new. There's been some version of this in cyber before we could use the word cyber, for example. We went back even to the 80s where people were sending floppy disks that would lock people's computer and ask for money orders sent to Panama and things like that. Now, the cool thing about back then is it was really hard to do this at scale, and it also was very difficult to transfer large sums of money. What's changed is the advent of cryptocurrency and the dark web, and that combination has really made it easy for folks to both create marketplaces where access is bought and sold, create an anonymous environment where you can sell platforms to deliver the service. And then of course, cryptocurrencies allowed us to, we don't have to send money orders anymore. We can transfer very large sums of capital across international borders, virtually undetected, or at least anonymously. There's also certain marketplaces that have popped up around this. And, so you'll hear things like initial access brokers. If you aren't familiar with that concept, that is basically a marketplace where threat actors are just simply selling the access, persistent stolen access to networks. Typically, the buyers of that access are ransomware attackers. Now, the thing that's really interesting is a lot of people who aren't in the space, I'm sure the audience here is aware, but a lot of people who aren't in the space assume that these bad guys are super sophisticated hackers. And the fact is they're really not using a lot of the sophisticated attacks. They're not writing custom malware. They're not buying 0 days. This last bullet in the lower right-hand corner basically illustrates that they're using some pretty low-hanging fruit attacks. A lot of those attacks are largely preventable, but they've been precipitated by, in the last few years, the work from home environment. I don't know, Bryce, if you want to add anything to this at all, or did I just steal all of the thunder on this slide?
No, you covered it pretty well. And I think one area that we also talk about is as the current state of ransomware is what threat actors are actually doing when they are hitting targets with ransomware. So we've seen the proliferation of shame sites or blogs that ransomware operators are using to publicize their attacks and share samples or tranches of data that have been exfiltrated from the victim. So we're not seeing simply an encryption of victim's network. We're seeing the exfiltration of data and extortion as an element of the ransom demand. So an evolving set of threats that each create an additional layer of complication when trying to respond to a ransomware attack.
Right, and it's iterative. It's continuing to evolve. So I mentioned where these things come from. They come from the dark web and underground marketplaces. They come from the anonymity that cryptocurrency affords threat actors to transfer currency. And then the pandemic has sort of facilitated an environment with an increased attack surface for the victim companies. Many of the cases that we've worked kind of boil down to some very simple things, and that is unsecured remote access, whether that's VPN or RDP, where if you think of it in the case of a large or small business, you've got an executive, they call the IT department, they're very angry, they're like, hey, I need access to blah, blah. Immediately, you open up an RDP port to get them access because you don't want to make the executive mad, and then you forget about it. And that coupled with perhaps a poor password policy, a poor credential policy, and lack of multi-factor authentication means there's a lot of these out there that the bad guys are attacking. And a lot of it is fully automated for the bad guys. So it's not like they're manually scanning your network, right? They've got tools to do that automatically. They have tools to try the RDP ports automatically. They have tools to try the stolen credentials automatically. So it's a push of a button for them. Say the pandemic has really opened up a lot of attack surface for them. So the idea of having a ransomware kill chain is, and I love how this is like making my hair look funny. So the ransomware kill chain is really, obviously we're staying on the shoulders of giants. There's been a Lockheed Martin kill chain for a very long time that really takes a simple model of looking how threat actors gained access in a traditional cyber attack. I don't have to tell the community about this. This has been around for a very long time, and we all understand the logic behind how these things happen. Ransomware does follow much of this almost identically. It's just got some nuances that make it slightly different. The unified kill chain was really the next step where we took things like attack and MITRE's attack, and we took the kill chain in the previous slide, and we added some meat to it, right? So Paul Pulse decided, hey, look, that original kill chain was great, but there's a little more detail required here around how these things occur. Again, most of these things are pretty much in parallel to what we see in a ransomware attack. But what we've learned firsthand working with the clients is there are some nuances that make it a little bit different on how the bad guys are operating. Bryce, anything you want to add to this?
No, I think I will save my thoughts for the ransomware kill chain.
Right on. So the idea is, in the case of ransomware, we need to look at it from a little bit different lens than we've traditionally looked at other attack frameworks. And let me just tell you, like from a real world scenario, how this often plays out, where most tools that we've developed around response, incident response plans and tools, all of those things had some assumptions about the cyber attack. And even if you zoom out, even outside of the technical and tactical components of this, the way the business viewed cyber attacks was quite a bit different, in that the cyber attacks were sometimes an embarrassment, often an annoyance, and sometimes you had to pay some fines, right? Because data left the building. What's changed here is that one, the motivation behind the attack is much more lucrative, right? So the bad guys are not monetizing stolen credentials, which go for pennies a piece on the dark web. They're getting paid huge sums of ransom. So the motivation's a little bit stronger. And two, these other cyber attacks, while they were annoying, sometimes embarrassing, like I said, occasionally you paid a fine, they did not disrupt the operation of the business. And so this is where it starts to change a lot. In a ransomware attack, it's not just that they've stolen your data, and they have, and Bryce will talk about that, but they have stopped your ability to operate. And that has, one of my friends is a marketing executive at another tech company, and he coined this phrase, the ransomware blast radius. So if you think about where the missile hits, that's the encryption. The rings of damage around that are massive, and a lot of people don't think about that. Bryce.
Yeah, so as Kurtis mentioned, we built this ransomware kill chain kind of on the shoulders of giants, shoulders of other well understood theories and frameworks that help the cybersecurity community understand a cyber attack. And the reason that we designed or codified the cyber kill chain is not to replace any theories or say that we're doing it correctly, our framework is more accurate. It's to map our collective understanding of frameworks to the evolving threat of ransomware and to update the frameworks that exist from a cyber attack perspective to match the current state of ransomware as it is here in 2022, late 2021, when we were working on this. So this is not meant to replace any existing theories, but to help us have a common understanding, a common framework to not only disrupt ransomware attacks, but also work with victims as they respond to the complex nature of ransomware attacks as they are today. And this is going to be an iterative process. Kurtis and I have talked about elements of the ransomware kill chain that we're presenting today that maybe we already want to update. And we will continue to see as ransomware operators update and iterate on their TTPs that our frameworks are going to need to be updated as well to match that. So we're presenting the kill chain here in its complete form, and we'll dive into each of these rings, access, exfil, and encryption on later slides. But presenting kind of the whole picture of the kill chain to, one, show the relationship between the different actors involved in more sophisticated ransomware attacks, or even some of the less sophisticated ransomware attacks. We understand that ransomware groups or affiliate programs are pretty sophisticated operations in 2022. So being able to represent the specialization or the specialized functions of individual actors in the kill chain was important. And also making sure that we have targets represented on this kill chain as well. So bringing in the targets to the framework so that we can understand that there are motivations behind attacks that ransomware operators are conducting, but also reasons that they're not targeting individual groups. So Kurtis, if you want to go to the next slide, we can talk some more on targets. So we have restricted, specified targets, and targets of opportunity. I want to talk about restricted first. We've seen publications or public statements from ransomware operators that claim they will not attack certain targets based on their geographic location or their industry. We saw some ransomware operators claim they will not attack healthcare organizations or hospitals during the COVID-19 pandemic. How true that was is not really up for debate because we've seen a large amount of attacks on healthcare organizations and hospitals. But more often we're seeing ransomware operators restrict their targets based on geographic location. So not attacking any companies in CIS or former Soviet Union states. Specified targets being targets that are in a specific geographic location. So maybe they're in the UK or the US or another Western country, or they're in a certain industry, or they have a certain revenue. Kurtis was talking a little bit about network access brokers. You'll see some offers or requests from ransomware operators looking for initial access to companies of a certain revenue above 500 million or above $1 billion in annual revenue to try to, again, go after a more lucrative target that can result in a larger payday. And then lastly, targets of opportunity. These are, successful social engineering attacks, maybe a company that had a vulnerability in a certain RDP software or program that the threat actor is scanning for open ports or scanning for a common vulnerability. And then that's the access that they are then selling or using to conduct a ransomware attack. And the last bullet point on their exposed credentials, we've talked about the role that lack of password hygiene or good password hygiene can play in the simplest of ransomware attacks. These are not necessarily the most sophisticated attacks, but they still result in the same damage, and it can result in the same amount of damage as a super sophisticated hack. So,
and I wanted to add to that, Bryce, that we believe there's a trend where threat actors will draft off of other successes. So, for example, if a threat actor group attacks I don't know, like a trucking and logistics software company. We would see then over the next 6 to 8 months, a bunch of attacks on trucking and logistics companies. If a threat actor is successful in penetrating a finance company, the same in the finance vertical. So while they're not necessarily targeting finance, if they get lucky enough to hit a service provider in that space, they often draft off the service provider and hit either their clients or constituents whose data is inside that platform.
Perfect. So let's talk about access, the first phase of our ransomware kill chain. And again, this maps similarly to the cyber kill chain or the unified kill chain that we've seen earlier, where threat actors are performing reconnaissance on targets. They are weaponizing their access. Kurtis is moving around the snowfields of this mountain. They are weaponizing their access and delivering it to the client, and then exploiting that access, and often then in the case of a ransomware attack, that access that an initial access broker was able to gain is then sold or passed along or used to start a ransomware attack. So that's this particular phase of the ransomware lifecycle that we're or the ransomware kill chain that we're seeing is often done by specialized individuals, specialized actors that are focused on generating the initial access that can then be used. So this portion of our kill chain maps pretty closely with the other existing kill chains that we mentioned earlier. Kurtis, anything to
add? Just among one of the things that you need to think about where the best places to disrupt this is one of the best places to disrupt it, right? Where using digital risk data, you can determine when these access brokers are selling that access and whether that's impacting your company or one of your partners or even one of your suppliers, like I mentioned in the previous slide. So getting in early, getting the intelligence data early about the attack is important. We've actually disrupted actual attacks and impacts from actual attacks, ransomware attacks, by detecting the access sale before the ransomware actors were successful in executing the attack.
Correct. Yeah, and that's a great point. I think when we get to the end of each of these circles is often where we see, from GroupSense's perspective, we see the greatest opportunity for digital risk protection to interrupt an attack. So, as we're on the exfil part of the kill chain, that initial access has been exploited and persistence has been maintained. The threat actor is able to escalate privileges inside the network to, instead of just exfiltrating data from one machine or one system, maybe they're escalating those privileges to get across your entire network, across servers, even sometimes into backups, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and discovering files or data that is of importance to them. There's been some really great research and publication on some of the queries that threat actors and ransomware groups are using to search for files or information. They're searching for HR information, they're searching for financial information, they're searching for tax information, legal documents that can be used in conversations or in extortion attempts. They're searching for trade secrets, intellectual property. So there's some really great, and we can link those in the Discord, I guess, so we have that tool. Really great research done on some of the queries that ransomware operators have used to discover files. And then we have lateral movement, obviously, within the network, and then data exfiltration. So an important part of the current ransomware operators attacks is to exfiltrate that data before they encrypt your network.
Yeah, and the thing I would add here is, the discovery phase is where the threat actors typically gain most of their leverage on the back end of this process. So over the last couple of years, we've seen them be very deliberate about the kind of data they're looking for, like Bryce said, and you can see some of these sample queries, but they are looking for, if they can get a copy of your financials, if they can get a copy of your cyber insurance policy, it's really hard for you to bluff them on how much money you have to spend because they have those records, right? And then, on the data exfil side, keep in mind that they're attempting to get all of this data someplace where they can use it against you from an extortion perspective, et cetera. Part of the discovery process, in addition to the financial documents and the data exfil part, are to grab things that would be potentially used as leverage against you from an HR perspective, from a HIPAA perspective. And we've even seen threat actors focus on, for example, executives' personal machines to see if they could get something personal about the executive outside the network where they can use it as leverage in the negotiations for payment.
Perfect. And then the last phase of our ransomware kill chain is the encryption. So after the data has been exfiltrated, and the threat actors have established command and control with their access, they will basically install the malware that encrypts everything that they have access to, stopping your services and preventing you from operating normally. So we've seen this affect clients or victims' ability to pay their employees if it's hitting their HR systems. We've seen it affect clients' abilities to collect payment from their point of service machines. So really, this is kind of the final stage where often ransomware attacks are the successful ransomware attacks are noticed because you come into work one Monday morning or late Friday afternoon or late Friday evening, and none of your machines are working. And there's either a note or some other notification from the ransomware actor that's claiming responsibility and giving you instructions on what to do next based on their attack.
Yeah, I think from a disruption perspective, this is another key point to detect. Although often what we've learned is at this point, it's almost too late because on the C2 component, there's a lot of EDR, XDR, detection systems that can pick up C2 communications. Although the threat actors are pretty clever about how they do this, and it's pretty disguised, so it's hard to catch. But when you do catch it, sometimes you can detect it and disrupt it. The challenge is the C2 has a heartbeat typically, and if you disrupt the heartbeat, sometimes they'll start pulling the ripcord and executing the ransomware to try to do as much damage as they can. And we've seen that firsthand as well.
Perfect. So, and then, after it's important to think about what happens kind of beyond the ransomware kill chain, all the implications of the data that's been exfiltrated and the considerations that the stakeholders at a victim organization will have to consider when choosing to or making the decision to either conduct negotiations or respond to how they're going to respond to the ransomware attack. So it's simply not just looking at the incident response plans as it pertains to backups, but the PR implications, marketing implications, and the cyber insurance implications, legal notifications. So there's many more considerations that happen after the ransomware kill chain has been successfully, from a threat actor perspective, successfully leveraged. So, Kurtis?
Yeah, and I think this is where we talk about that ransomware blast radius metaphor, where a lot of companies recognize that typically in a ransomware attack, it's disruptive to the business. Like we all get that. Like nothing works, right? It's becoming pretty well and commonly known that they took some of our data and they're going to threaten to dump it. But what's often sort of the soft effects that are often lost in that is employee morale, customer confidence, public relations, all these things that Bryce mentioned. All of those do have a cost and an impact on the business. So you want me to take this one, Bryce, for a minute?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to put my head between. Look at that. So just a few things that we learned, the do's and do nots in a case like this. Obviously, there is a process and a known response process now on how to deal with these cases. Don't panic. One of the things I will also say is, do not just Google "help me decrypt," Ragnar Locker, or help, how to respond to, our evil. Don't do that, because there's a number of scammers who pay for the Google AdWords for those searches, and I won't get into the details of those scams, but the types of results you're going to get in your first search for trying to resolve this is not going to be in your favor. You also don't want to engage the threat actor until you absolutely have to, right? So the ransomware note is going to be very compelling. It's going to try to get you to talk to the bad guy as soon as possible. They might even offer you a discount if you talk to them within the first 24 hours or something like that. The issue is with that is often when you're engaging with the threat actors, the ransom note will send you to a dark website where you'll interact with the threat actors. That dark website typically has a clock. You go to that ransomware site and clock starts ticking down, and that they attach a bunch of threats to the sort of the culmination of that clock, which is things like we'll double the ransom amount, we'll start dumping data, etc. So our recommendation would be don't engage until you're absolutely ready, and there's a process around getting ready. Also, we just went through a case where unfortunately the IT department didn't really recognize what was going on, that it was a ransomware attack, and they started rebooting machines. Now we all know the joke, right? Like if it's not working, what do? You turn it off, turn it back on, right? Don't do that. Don't do that here, because what happens is often the ransomware's encryption software is usually pretty buggy. And if you start rebooting machines, renaming files, anything like that, it'll cause issues. I'm going to leave a couple open for Bryce to talk about, but I'm going to hammer through these quickly. We always recommend engaging legal counsel. That ransomware blast radius also has some potential legal components to it, where depending on where you're located, you may have breach notification laws and things like that come into effect. Those usually have timelines associated with them. So know that. PR support. The biggest mistakes that we've seen made on that back end of these by companies is miscommunicating the breach information or the attack information. And we've seen that play out in lawsuits and so on. So having someone, both legal and PR, advise you on what to say to your employees, what to say to your partners, what you have to share, what you shouldn't share, etc. IR, obviously, having an IR team is important, and an IR plan is important. Practicing the plan is also important. I will say, I'll just give you an anecdote where this is another scenario where the ransomware case is quite different. We've seen time after time where the traditional ransomware or the traditional IR plan sort of falls apart in a ransomware scenario because it was written for traditional cyber attacks, which haven't disrupted business. My favorite anecdote is, and this has happened, where we're in the boardroom and everybody's like, the first few questions I ask when we're on a case is, I ask the legal question, I ask the PR question, I ask, have you engaged IR? Where are you on your plan? When we get to that question, the executives will say something along the lines of, yeah, about the plan. Well, the plan is a file, and the file is on a server. The server is encrypted. We don't have a copy of the plan. It's 200 pages and we don't have it memorized, so we're winging this thing. Well, you don't want to be winging this thing, right? So it's like little nuanced things like that to think about in a ransomware case. Obviously, if you have cyber insurance, the one thing people, when they have cyber insurance, they feel a little bit confident that this is going to get taken care of, but read the fine print and read the fine print in the cyber insurance before the incident, because in the cyber insurance policy, typically they're going to tell you which order to contact all the people that I talked about before and when. They'll have timelines associated with that. You deviate too far off those timelines, or you don't contact people in the right order, or you don't contact people at all, they may not pay out. So something to keep in mind. Professional responder. Obviously, we've been doing this for a while. We consider ourselves professional responders. All I can say is anybody can read a negotiation book and say, I know how to do negotiations. And at one point that was us, right? But we learned a lot over the last few years. And there's a lot of nuances to this particular discipline. One, in typical negotiation strategy, whether you're reading the Harvard Business Review, Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference, whatever, they assume things like you can see the person, you can hear the tone of their voice, eye contact, body language, none of that stuff exists here. Also, they assume that maybe the leverage is somewhat symmetric. It's not. Bad guys have all the leverage, right? And then the other one is often, or at least most of the time, you're assuming they speak your language. And quite frankly, on larger groups like our Evil, for example, the first person you deal with probably doesn't speak English at all. That means that when you type something to them, so first of all, they're pasting an English script into the window at you. And when you respond, they're taking what you say and they're putting it in Babelfish or Google Translate, right? And why that's an important nuance is that you better understand the words you just chose and how they translate, not just literally from word to word, but also in tone and context in Ukrainian or Russian, because doing that incorrectly can cost you money. So it is very nuanced discipline from a ransomware response perspective. Obviously, we recommend to every victim that they notify law enforcement. it is not illegal to pay a ransom with some exceptions, and Bryce will talk about those exceptions. I met with an FBI representative, cyber representative over the weekend, and we talked about this. And you know, their official stance, the Justice Department's official stance still is you should not pay the ransom, and they will tell you that. But they understand it's not illegal. They just have to recommend that you don't. And if you're in a scenario where you're going to either lose your business or lay off most of your staff, or you have to pay a ransom, often you're going to pay something. So engage a professional responder and make sure that you pay as little as possible. And then of course, you know, on the back end of a case, you really want to, you just made a deal with a bad guy. And that deal is, hey, they're going to give you some decryptors. They're going to tell you how they broke in. We always ask for that. Sometimes we get it. And they're also going to promise that they deleted your data. But there's no way, even if sometimes they'll send you videos to try to prove it, things like that. But storage is cheap. They probably still have a copy. You want to make sure that they have no honor or accountability, by the way. So you want to make sure that the data that they've taken from you does not start surfacing on the dark web later on or something like that. And this is a good thing from a PR perspective to tell your constituents, like, look, we made this deal with this person, but just in case, we've hired a company to help us make sure that that data doesn't surface someplace. Bryce, do you want to touch on a couple?
Yeah, I want to touch on sanctions specifically. So one thing that is important to do throughout the process, and it can be a very important layer or complicating factor to ransomware attacks, is understanding the sanctions implications, OFAC sanctions in the US, and then there are, you know, sanctions regimes in the EU, in Japan, and other countries. So understanding the potential sanctions implications, and that there are ransomware groups, ransomware operators that are sanctioned entities or offshoots of previously sanctioned entities. And that's often one of the big questions that insurers are asking throughout the process, and looking for documentation that this payment is not going to a sanctioned entity. So using any of the indicators that you can get throughout the ransomware attack, whether that be the Bitcoin wallet or other cryptocurrency wallets that the threat actors provide, or IP addresses and such that you can get through your forensics when investigating the attack. So making sure you're thinking of sanctions from the beginning of the attack and at every stage of the response to a ransomware attack, because you'll need to have those questions answered for your insurance company. Law enforcement will often ask about it, and law enforcement may even be able to help provide you some resources to conduct the sanction check. And lastly is the point in the top right. Don't bury your head in the sand. Having backups and restoring from the backups doesn't mean the problem is going to go away. The threat actors we've seen ransomware operators publish gigabytes, hundreds of gigabytes, in some cases terabytes of data that they've exfiltrated from victim organizations, because the victim organizations either have not negotiated or not engaged. We've also seen ransomware operators who will hit a victim a second time because, you know, they've restored from backup, but they haven't completely removed the initial access or interrupted the initial access that was used to conduct the attack. And so there is still an important set of considerations that you have to make, even if you have the ability to restore from backups. We have seen some of the better or largest reductions of an initial demand in negotiations that we're conducting are often related to organizations that have the ability to restore from backup. But even if you're able to restore 90 or 95% of your data from backups, there still can be some critical systems that maybe haven't been backed up recently, or some data that you've lost in the process. So just because you have backups, that does mean you're in a more favorable position, but it doesn't mean that the situation is over and that you can just move on from.
Well, we're still recording. I think we lost Bryce and not me. Hopefully they can edit that out. But what Bryce was getting at was to be aware of the fact that backups aren't going to necessarily save you in this scenario. The other thing I will add to that is that backups, I've seen overconfidence with backups where companies say, hey, we've got backups. Tell these guys to get lost. We got this. And we'll take it on the chin on the exfiltration component. Like, don't worry about that. And so we say, hey, that's great. We don't want to pay bad guys either. Good for you. And then they go away and they come back and they say, hey, guess what? It turns out it's going to take us 6 months to restore these backups, and we haven't really tested. So there's a case there for also going back and both testing your IR plan, but also testing your business continuity plan to understand the mechanics of potentially restoring everything in your network from backup. It's non-trivial, right? Bryce, are you back with us?
I am back with you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent.
I didn't know if it was you or me, so I made. Hopefully they'll edit a little bit, maybe, but I probably looked silly while I was trying to figure out what happened. But yeah, so welcome back. So I closed out your backup discussion, added a little context, and we're at the final slide here.
Yeah. So, the most important takeaway is to apply what you've learned. In reviewing your organization's IR plans and determine how prepared you are to interrupt and respond to a ransomware attack, but also assessing the exposure that you have from in your digital footprint and determine the number of exposures that you have to potential attacks, that particularly those that can be exploited by the initial access brokers at the beginning of the ransomware kill chain. We think that, again, ransomware as it is today, or ransomware, the kind of widespread proliferation of ransomware and the complexities that are now introduced in contemporary ransomware attacks move beyond some of the more traditional cyber attacks that we've seen previously and add layers of complexity that need to be considered across the C-suite as you're responding to a ransomware attack. So understanding the stakeholders that you need to pull in from a corporate communications perspective or a legal perspective or a PR perspective that are traditionally maybe not brought in your IR preparedness plans or in some of the other incident responses that you may conduct, and implementing a break glass in case of emergency version of a ransomware response plan. A physical copy, as Kurtis has mentioned before, it does you no good when it's on an encrypted machine. But a physical copy that takes in these complexities and takes in the considerations that you must have when trying to respond to an attack that not only encrypts your network, but also has an extortion element and an exfiltration element as well.
And that really brings us to the end. I think we might have run a little over on time. I just want to say, thanks for allowing me to be the floaty head, and thanks to Bryce for being the ethereal voice from the sky. And also wanted to say special thanks and well wishes to Nicole and her family. And sorry she couldn't be here. We're going to duck out to do the Q&A session. Looking forward to discussing this in more detail there. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for having us. Have a good CactusCon.
Thank you.